Deyan Sudjic. Forgive me, but I will be speaking in English, but we have a trusty translator at the back of the room, which is why I'm speaking into this microphone so he can hear me. And welcome to the blazing hot Moscow summer, which I hear so much about. I am here to talk about design, and I call my talk The Language of Things, which is a way of understanding design. There are many ways to think about design. We are educated as architects, well, I was educated as an architect, to understand design as a matter of solving a problem. So that there was such a thing as functionalism, which is the idea that if you state a problem and examine it carefully enough, you will find the best technical solution to deal with it. But I've always also thought there are many other ways to understand what design is about. It's about emotions, and about a sense of identity, and about value. Maybe some of the reasons that I've seen design in those ways are to do with my personal autobiography. I was born in England, but of Yugoslav parents, and I can remember the day when I realized that my parents spoke English with a different accent from mine, and I began to understand how it is that we use language to show who belongs and who doesn't belong, and the other ways in which we manufacture ideas of identity. So, for example, just before ex-Yugoslavia fell into many pieces, even before Croatia and Slovenia set up their own armies, they'd started to design their banknotes. And the old Yugoslavia had the dinar, which on each note you saw pictures of heroic workers and peasants, and steelworks and locomotive factories. And to show how modern and forward-looking Croatia and Slovenia were, they started to put 19th century architects, 18th century astronomers, and 16th century composers on their money. And they also abolished the iconography of socialism. So no more wheat sheaves and hammers and sickles, but the Croatians made money that looked just like Deutschmarks, and the Slovenes used contemporary design to show something about what they're about. So that was an early moment for me to begin to understand the reasons and the motivations beyond function that drive design. And it's what also got me thinking about how design really works. And you could see design in two ways. One is as a form of cultural expression. Design reflects who we are and what we are. And at the other extreme, design is something which is used to persuade us to buy more stuff, to make us part with things, to make us part with money for things that we feel that we must have. So design is about manufacturing desire. It's a kind of conjuring trick, one might say. And I think we become suspicious of design. We're starting to think that the world has got too much design. We're being all asked to consume too much stuff. And so I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Language of Things, which is in some ways an attempt to understand this process by which design manufactures desire, and to try to inoculate myself against it, and maybe to explore what it is that's going on. So, at the most extreme form, design is a conjuring trick, which you can see nowhere more clearly than, and I seem to have lost the power of movement with my, it's nowhere more extreme than in money. And this is a series of worthless pieces of paper. They're all rectangles, but a designer has been at work to try to transform them into from a worthless piece of paper into something that is worth something. And not just worth something, but worth something in an American way, or a European way, or a British way, or if you're Swiss and more confident about yourself, in a Swiss way. And it's really interesting. How do designers make worthless pieces of paper look valuable? Well, in America, they try to make them look like Cuban cigar box labels, with the extensive use of elderly engraving and lots of portraits, usually of men, almost always of men, and quite often with too much facial hair. In the case of the euro, and it's a little digression, but Britain had a rather useless prime minister called John Major, but he had one very good idea before the euro was invented, because the word euro is so obviously an artificial word. And Major had the idea of saying, let's not call it the euro, let's call it the florin. Interesting idea, because it's an old word which many people have used in Europe. Anyway, he was unsuccessful. And in the case of the euro, we have this very obvious symbolism. The European Union obviously believes in progress, because its currency starts with representations of Roman doorways and bridges, and progresses through the Gothic period and the Renaissance to end up with really high value notes which have modern curtain wall glazing to show that we're looking ahead. And of course, because it's the European Union, they can't be specific pictures of bridges or doorways or gateways. They have to be abstracted. So no one nation gets upset by the end of the others having their monuments or landmarks placed on them. And then, of course, Britain is rooted in the past, so it designs its money to have these kind of strange typographic quirks to remind people of what money used to look like in the 19th century. Whereas the Swiss are confident enough about the value of the Swiss franc to go in for a bit of abstraction, and they even turn their money on the side to actually surprise us. So here is design reduced to a conjuring trick. Design is being used to make us respond to pieces of paper in a particular way. And you could say that something like that view of design is like something like what is going on in art. This is a work of art which sits in the Tate Gallery in London. It's by an American artist called Michael Craig Martin. And this piece is actually called Oak Tree. And according to Michael, it is an oak tree, because as the artist, he says it's an oak tree, so in his mind, it is an oak tree, so it should be in ours as well. So that is an extreme form of what design is doing. It's actually transforming worthless materials into something else. And even in a functional view of the universe, even in something apparently as functionally determined as orbiting the Earth in space, I think you can still see that there are such things as national characteristics in the way that design works. This is an image which is captured in reality in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, and the two actual orbiting capsules, one from the Soviet Union and one from America, hang in the lobby to the Air and Space Museum, capturing this moment of cooperation towards the end of the Cold War, when there was a link-up in space. And you would think that there could be no more difficult technical problem than blasting off into space and orbiting the Earth. And you would imagine then that both sides would come up with exactly the same technical solution. But of course, you can at once see which of these halves is from the Soviet Union and which is from America. The Soviet half has the air of Jules Verne, with brass portholes and a dentist's armchair inside the capsule. And the American half has the atmosphere of Detroit, chrome fins, like a kind of car, the consumer version of the space probe. Even in space, there are emotional issues going on with design. And another interesting area where the same sort of thing is going on is in the field of military camouflage. Now, on one level, camouflage is there to make armies invisible. But, of course, every army in the world has its own camouflage, so that you look completely invisible in an American desert way, or in a Syrian winter uniform, or in British Army, Northern Europe, or whatever. So you're reminded that design is not only about function, it's also about communication and representation and understanding what those signals are. Now, one has to be careful about national characteristics in design. It can be reduced quite quickly to stereotypes. And you ask yourself what it is that makes you see this Citroën de Chevaux and immediately see this as a piece of French design. If you set this next to a Volkswagen Beetle, immediately this you see as a piece of German design. And on one level, the de Chevaux looks French because we've seen it as part of the French landscape for so long. So it's about familiarity. On another level, of course, it's because it was designed by a brilliant French engineer, Pierre Boulanger, with the engineering techniques that were particular to France, so you can see things that this car has in common with the way in which, for example, Jean Prouvé manufactured furniture and architecture. And it was designed to be within the price range that a French farmer could afford, and to be tough enough to stand up to bad French pre-war roads. So you could see this as, yes, rooted in a sense of France, not just how French things are meant to look. But you'd also have to say that car design has moved on from this period, when there was a technical response, to this period when design of cars has become something rather different. When Henry Ford produced the Model T Ford in 1907, he was producing a car as if no car had ever been designed before. It was a technical solution. But we now belong to a period in which car design has become something else, something much more knowing. And you'd also have to see this Bentley in terms of what it means to represent an idea about what a British car might be. So on one level, the Bentley is presented as being the essence of Britishness. And yet, of course, it belongs to a German company, and the individual who led the styling team that designed this car was Brazilian, whose previous job had been working for Skoda in the Czech Republic. And for a designer to do that means that he's not designing the way that Henry Ford did, but he's producing something which is more like breeding rare sheep. So this is a car which has to have a pedigree, and it has to have every detail reflecting that pedigree. So does it have its grandfather's ears, stroke wing mirror? Does it look like its father's headlamps, etc., etc.? So here is design turned into something which is very much a knowing process. I think you can also understand typography in this kind of sense. It's fascinating that we call type a typeface, and I think face is a very good word to use because we recognize faces and characteristics. So when you see Helvetica, which is what this face is, you get a sense of the Swiss identity. Or if you see this sign, you know at once that you are actually in America. This again is a typeface which was designed for use on American highways and is supposedly about being able to understand and read a sign as you're going past very quickly. And yes, it does that. But also this type, and it's called interstate, immediately tells you that you are in America. There's something unmistakably American about this, whether it's American through familiarity or through some innate characteristic. Uniforms, as I said with Camouflage, are supposedly about function, but of course function for the army or the police is also about looking big and fierce, or in the case of the Italian Carabinieri, looking smart, and it's no surprise to hear that Giorgio Armani was involved as a consultant on making this particular version of the Italian Carabinieri's uniform. And the way that fashion and dress is presented also is something which architects sometimes present as being somehow rather frivolous, but I've never seen it that way. Most industrial systems begin through textiles and manufacturing cloth and then moving into fashion, and the way that fashion is now presented is done with great seriousness. This is Tarando's theatre for Giorgio Armani in Milan, which is a place used to show his collections, and a place in which architecture is used to show that this stuff matters, and that the contemporary collection has become something very much like opera was in the 19th century, so that the audience here goes not just to see the clothes, but actually to see each other and to create a sense of event and occasion around this. And this is really to kind of reinforce my point about how fashion is used to express things. This is the Emperor of Japan around 1928 with the Crown Prince. And this is a period only 60, 70 years before was the moment when Japan opened to the outside world. Before that, there was a death sentence for even talking to foreigners. And as the regime which decided that it had to open to the outside world said Japan was going to accept modern technology to change on the outside so that it could stay the same on the inside. And so in the early 20th century, the way that Japan said it was a modern state was to look as much as possible like the West. Things have changed a lot now, and you could say that the way that contemporary Japan has become confident about its own identity is we are now in a period where for 30, 40 years Japan has accepted the fashion not something it simply imports from the outside, but Japan is also a place which invents and creates a sense of what fashion can be. This is Kemal Atatürk, another statesman who used dress to make a major point about his sense of what national identity was about, and which he used in the transformation of the Ottoman Empire into modern Turkey. I mean, you could say he was a soldier, but you could also see him as, in some senses, an art director. Within 3 years of taking power, he had moved the capital of Turkey from Istanbul to a new creation in Ankara. He had imported Western architects to build that capital. He had abolished Arabic script, which was the way in which Turkey communicated, and introduced a new Latin script. He had changed national dress, and he had made an image of a new state through design, through architecture. And it starts to make you really, consider in the same way as I was talking earlier about how, former Yugoslavia broke up with new symbols and new sign of national identity. One begins to understand that these symbols and signs are not things that grow out of the soil. They are manufactured, they are designed, sometimes cynically, sometimes with sincerity. And an expert use of design is someone who understands the many meanings that design can have and which it's based on. Another way to look at design is in this strange cultural hierarchy that we seem to have. There was a very interesting American economist from the early part of the 20th century called Thorsten Veblen, who wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. He was the first person to use the word conspicuous consumption. He was basically an economist, but unlike most economists who try to understand money and the way it moves, Veblen tried to understand the economy through the way that people behave and their behaviors. And he analyzed most societies as being based on a social hierarchy, a pyramid. And at the most narrow part of the pyramid at the top are those the elite, who do not have to work. Once they were warriors and priests and an aristocracy, and Now they are still politicians and those who work with their brains and artists. And halfway down this hierarchy are the merchants, and at the bottom of the pyramid are those who have to work with their hands. And every society has constructed an iconography to demonstrate where you are in this pyramid. So at the top of the pyramid, you might wear white to demonstrate that you don't have to worry about keeping your clothes clean, and you might wear high heels to show that you don't need to worry about moving around. And other signs might be, the question of a suntan. In earlier times, people who had sunburn were those who had to work in the fields. And then for a very short period, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the elite would also have suntans in winter to show they could afford to go to hot places and come out with a suntan. And now again it's reverted to those who have suntans, to those who don't know better that sunburn can cause skin cancer, and the elite have gone back to being extremely pale. This is a long-winded explanation to really talk about design's position in this social hierarchy, because design, unlike art, has this burden of utility. Art is quote-unquote useless, so it's considered as being more valuable than design, which is in some senses useful. So this image behind me is an image that Andy Warhol made before he was an artist. It was when he was still an illustrator, working for magazines to do fashion illustrations. And it was only later that he became an artist, and towards the end of his career as an artist, he was turning out portraits on an industrial scale. And this is a portrait of Juliana Benetton, which strangely became the label for the Benetton shoe brand. So is this an artwork but used commercially, and this is an illustration but which sort of shows shoes, and when he was working as an artist, I don't think he was paid by Campbells to advertise their soup, but this is an artwork which I suppose analyzes the everyday world around us, and it's exploring the imagery and the identity of design. In the contemporary world, we see brands like Prada being very careful in the way that they use art and architecture to burnish their brand. So this is Andreas Gursky, an artist photographing a shoe shop to suggest that it's actually a very culturally aware shoe shop. Or this is the Prada store in Tokyo, in which the architecture is from Herzog and de Meuron, who are of course by no means accidentally also the architects of the Tate Modern building in London. So the message under the surface here is that Prada is a very culturally aware brand, and that what you might find inside their shop/museum is in some senses fashion/art. And these ideas about what design is in the industrially produced world have been interrogated and explored by artists for a very long time. Duchamp was telling us something about objects and something about the cut between the idea of the artist's hand and the idea of the ready-made, and asking us to look at objects and the everyday around us in a very interesting way, which designers, I think, still haven't quite managed to catch up with. And you could perhaps see Hearst as carrying on this tradition. I think this is an interesting pair. Of course, this is the useless, worthless object, and this is the very expensive, worthless object. It's branding as well. This is not design, but it's asking us to think about how we create value in design and art. But really going back to some of the roots of design and its origins, I think, as I've said, there's two views of what design is. One is the idea that design is some kind of cultural expression, some kind of moral value, and the other is it's some kind of sense of being about commerce, about selling things, about helping manufacturers and industrialists make things. So you could trace back the idea of design as some kind of cultural, moral expression to William Morris, the English socialist, revolutionary, and wallpaper designer, which is a combination which could sound like the invention of a satirist, but he was all of those things. And this was a piece of textile, which Morris designed in the 1870s. And Morris was a man who believed in the dignity of labor, in the sense that design should be something which made everyday life better. He was the product of the English Industrial Revolution, which was the first industrial society, the first culture in which the connection between craft, handmaking, and the consumer was broken, and the idea of design was introduced, and that there was a step between the maker and the consumer, which was what the designer did. He was in the midst of a moment when mass production had transformed everyday life, and yet he rejected it. He was taken as a 17-year-old to the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, which was the celebration par excellence of industrial manufacturing. And as a 17-year-old, he was so convinced that everything inside it was going to be so horrible, he refused to set foot inside it. So this was a designer in some way as a kind of critic of industrialization, which is a strange place to be, because without industry, design does not exist. But this is a designer saying it's created a terrible system. So this is one kind of design. And the other kind of design is represented most clearly by Raymond Loewy, a Frenchman who went to America just after World War I, who was the man who said he was going to streamline the sales curve. So he was hugely proud that when Lucky Strike hired him to redesign their cigarette packet, simply by turning the color of the pack from green to white, he claimed that they doubled sales. This is the kind of boast that designers even today would be kind of quite worried about making, because of course you are persuading people to smoke more. Not such a good idea perhaps. But he was also the man who hired a public relations consultant whose job was to get him on the cover of Time magazine, and he succeeded. So here are two ideas of what design is: a moral crusade or selling more stuff. Now, Morris was an interesting figure. Loewy was too. Not everything that Loewy did was quite as cynical as this. He made wonderful steam locomotives that looked extraordinary. He repackaged electrical equipment, which looked great. He produced this idea of design as something to seduce the public with. And that tension, I think, is still going on. You could see Philippe Starck as the contemporary equivalent of Raymond Loewy, the designer who decided that it was not design, but the designer himself should be his greatest creation. The designer who has to tell a story about all his objects. It's amazing how quickly the TV set has become a historical artifact. This is only 20 years old, but the whole idea of cathode ray tube television is dead. But this is a product which I think is a very interesting one from Starck. He was hired by a French consumer electronics company to try to give them a future, which was difficult given the fact that most TV sets by that time were being made in Japan and then Korea and China. But he started to play around with perceptions of what you put a TV set in. And here he was playing around with the idea of wood. This is a very cheap chipboard material, molded, and it's playing around with our expectations of what design might look like. But Starck was still about seducing us, trying to persuade us that this was a desirable object which we must have. And on the other side of this seduction morality line is Dieter Rams, who for 40 years worked for one company, Brown. And Rams didn't reject industry, but he did reject the idea of seduction. He rejected the idea of design which kept changing. He believed that there was a functional issue, and that if you analyze a problem carefully enough, then you will find the perfect radiused corner, the perfect material, the perfect combination. And in a way, he made beautiful objects, but really sadly, of course, he was left looking out of date, not by visuals, but by technology. So he made whole categories of objects, record players, calculators, that no longer exist. We no longer have objects which we call calculators. So it's not the visual language that's gone in his case, it's technology has left him looking redundant. And we've moved in our relationships with objects. This is a reminder of how things move so fast. This is the calculator interface from the first generation iPhone. We're now on to generation 4 in 3 years. Interesting, shows how rapidly things change. And this is Jonathan Ives' homage to Dieter Rams, using the same colors for the buttons on the calculator, and reminding us of a moment when design seemed more about permanent values than it does now, and a moment when design also seemed to be more about physical things than they do now, and also a way in which we understand that objects have started to converge, so that this object is not just a telephone, but a calculator, a navigation system, a camera, a music system, and so many other things as well. And we've moved from a time when a telephone was this object. It has its roots in a Norwegian painter who worked for Matisse, who went home to Norway and was hired to make a design for a telephone. And this became the archetypal pattern for what telephones looked like for 4 or 5 generations. And they remind us of a time when the telephone was not a consumer object. It was something, in Britain at least, which you rented from the government, and you had it for 20 years, and they were quite unusual. The object was designed in such a way to make you understand what it did. So one end of the handset had the mouthpiece, so you could tell which bit you spoke into. The other bit you could see, which was the ear. You could work out how you, I'm not sure what the Russian word is, but in English you dial this, because you turn the dial. Of course, now you don't dial anymore, you key or button, but many people still use that word dial, and this has become the shape for telephony, even though it's no longer the shape that we use to make telephones. It affects the way that we behave. In my house, growing up in London in the 1950s and 60s, telephones were quite rare, so you certainly didn't have more than one in the house, and you kept it in the hallway of the house where the whole family could use it, which was the coldest room in the house, and you had it on a table and you answered it standing up. And you knew that if you were being called to the telephone, it was going to be bad news, so you approached this thing with extreme caution and anxiety, and you developed a routine for answering the telephone. You'd stand up and you would say your name, hello, my name is, and then you'd tell your telephone number. So there's this whole ritual around it. In Italy, people still answer the telephone with the word pronto, meaning ready, which makes you think maybe this is a ritual that came from the days when Marconi laid the first transatlantic telephone cable, and he had a sailor on each end of the phone answering it by saying pronto, ready. We don't have those kind of rituals for mobile phones. We're still hardwired to answer, even if we're in the middle of a funeral. And I think this is really trying to talk about the way that designers need to understand the way that people use things, as well as what they look like and how they respond to them. Another object which has really has disappeared into the mobile phone is the camera. Again, when I was taking photographs back in the 60s and 70s, there was a thing called film, and cameras were these kind of very elaborate mechanical objects which sort of grew old gracefully. This was a Nikon, which was the sort of thing that war photographers used in Vietnam, and as they went around in the battlefield, they would tape over the Nikon logo so that they couldn't be seen by snipers. And as the camera got older, the black got bashed around, and you could start to see bronze, brass shining through it. It looked better as it grew older, like an old pair of jeans. And we don't have that same sense of objects growing old gracefully anymore. They deteriorate really, really fast. We don't have objects that have memories, that they carry memories of what they were and who they were owned by. And we have different understandings of the language of them. The camera was black, which suggested that this was not a consumer object, black was the color of serious technical objects. Except, of course, when Ettore Sottsass made the first Valentine typewriter for Olivetti. And this, in reality, is a red typewriter with orange spools. In a way, what Sottsass was doing for Olivetti was something very much like what Jonathan Ives did for Apple 10 years ago when he made the first iBooks, which came in translucent colors with translucent plastic with fruit colors inside. He was transforming what was a industrial business object into a consumer item. And when the Valentine typewriter was launched, Sottsass suggested that it was designed to keep poets company on lonely Sundays in the countryside, which of course is telling you that designers have always been storytellers, one might say. But this is Ives doing the same kind of job, and there was a moment when having one of these iBooks was the object to have on your desk to show that you were really state-of-the-art startup company, said that you were really state-of-the-art, edgy, and of course now it looks as embarrassing as very flared trousers once did, as opposed to narrow ones. I wrote my first book on a typewriter, and it was the most physically demanding experience you could imagine, because you had a sense of perfection in those days. You wanted to make each sheet perfectly typed, so you typed and retyped, which left your fingers red raw with blood after a while. It was a physically demanding process. And my typewriter actually used to belong to my father, and he bequeathed it to me. And it was the sort of thing that was meant to last a lifetime. By the time I bought my first MacBook, I'd actually had 2 other laptops, each of which was so sophisticated that you imagined that they would last you a lifetime. But of course, you change it every 18 months. And my previous version was this thing. And then I realized one day that I was going to have to get a new one. And I had this kind of moment of epiphany in the electronics shop at Heathrow Airport. Not the kind of place that usually gets seduced by objects in, but I realized I was going to have to change my laptop. And in the store, which is not a place which you get seduced because you're in a hurry to catch your plane, I saw Apple had a choice of models. There was this MacBook, and next to it was the MacBook all in white. Now, I'd had a white computer before, and I realized that actually white was last year's color, but this was the first all-black MacBook. And there's something so seductive about black, because of course black is the color that treats you as if you are grown up enough not to be seduced by color, which is the most seductive thing of all. So I had to have the black one. It was slightly more expensive than the white one, but I got this thing. And of course there is that moment of rush, if you think a new thing and you have that, it's that addictive moment when you finally got this new object. It was great. And then I took it out of the box. And there was a slight moment of, because though the machine itself is all black, the power cord, of course, is white. Now, it's not that a white power cord makes it work any less, but somehow this kind of supreme intelligence of Jonathan Ives and Cupertino and Steve Jobs, why couldn't they be consistent enough to make it a black power cord? And then, of course, you realize that though Ives and the design team at Apple are really smart people who actually make the interface really delightful to use, they had left out a few things, like the understanding, of course, that human beings touch these things, and human beings have skin, and skin is greasy, and when you start to touch your MacBook in its delicious black finish, quite soon it starts to show your hands and grease, and the trackpad starts to look like a duck pond very quickly. And then of course you use this thing in bed while you're eating biscuits, and your hair has dandruff, and quite quickly the keyboard fills up with crumbs and dirt, and you realize that of course you are spoiling the thing that you love very quickly. I talked earlier about car design, and you could say it's arguable that there are 2 great moments in 20th century car design. The first one was the Model T Ford, where Henry Ford made a car on a production line, and for the first time made it cheap enough for his workforce to buy one, and for it not to be seen simply as a kind of land yacht used by enthusiasts. And it was a car like no other. And the second, to me, key moment in the history of car design in the 20th century was the Nissan Figaro. There was something like 8 million Model T Fords made, and there were only 25,000 of this thing. And inside, the mechanics are a very mass-produced Nissan. But on the outside is this extraordinary realization that, in fact, people now treat cars as very large toys for adults, and that they have an emotional interaction with them. And this is a car designed like fashion. So it was done to try and trigger a series of memories. There's a bit of 1950s Frenchness to this, a bit of 1950s Italian sports car, a bit of Japaneseness, a bit of cuteness. So it's a car which looks like it's sort of always existed but hasn't. And this, to me, when a mainstream Japanese car company did, was a license for a very transformational idea about what design could and could not do. And pretty quickly, a lot of other people were doing it too. So this is the Renault answer to this. It was designed by a man called Patrick Lequemont, who told me that his brief from Renault was to design a car that looked so cute, it would put the family dog out of business. And you can see the techniques. It's basically anthropomorphics. So there's a little slight smile in the radiator, and there's great big cute eyes that look like Betty Boop or something. So here is design turned from being a moral crusade, turned from being about function, into this very different idea about design as touching emotional resonances and seduction. And when the consumer is being seduced by the designer, they're not fools, they're not stupid, they understand that there is something going on, and it's a kind of bargain. You don't want to be taken for a ride too much, you don't want a car which stops working after a week, but you also are prepared to be entertained and charmed by this process. This is a concept car that was done by Mark Newson for Ford, again learning some of those cuteness, emotional messages as opposed to simple functional ideas, which is a one-dimensional idea of design. This is Newson's other piece, the Lockheed Lounge, which takes us to this very strange territory where art collides with design. This was a limited edition, which is interesting as a concept for design. This is, will go down in history as the first piece of contemporary design which sold at auction for more than $1 million, which starts to make one think about it stopped being design, because if we say that art is seen as being valuable because it's useless and design goes down the hierarchy because it's useful, if there's a price tag of $1 million on a chaise lounge, of course it immediately becomes useless because you couldn't possibly sit on something that is worth so much that if you scratch it, you're going to deteriorate its values. It's the first time that I've heard the concept of artist's proof being used for furniture. Ex-showroom stock might be another way of describing it. But Newson is an interesting designer, no question about it. He has had an obsession with some of the alternative modernity, which you can see is the Soviet Union's contribution to design in the 20th century. I think you'd also have to ask questions about what kind of sense it makes if a piece like this sells for $1 million, where you could actually buy a piece of furniture which Rietveld not only designed but used and sat on for a quarter of the price of this. But we are now in a world in which a kind of art market has started to colonize design, which is both an opportunity and a threat, I think. Talking a little bit about how design appears outside the gallery, but also in the museum. You could say that there's been maybe 3 generations of design in museums. The first one was in London. After 1851 and the Great Exhibition, Britain started the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was the world's first museum of design, whose purpose was to educate manufacturers in how to make products that could compete better with other countries' industries. And very quickly it became a different kind of museum. Because of this cultural hierarchy, its curators decided that useful things were somehow vulgar, and should not be what they were interested in, and they became a museum of decorative art. A fantastically powerful, wonderful museum of decorative art, but not one which is about the contemporary world of design. And the second museum that took on design as a subject was the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is what this image is of. And in the 1930s, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, started to show things like ball bearings next to Leger paintings of ball bearings. But in the case of the Museum of Modern Art, design was allowed in, but only if it was presented as if it was sculpture. So this is the most extreme example of that. This is the helicopter which the Museum of Modern Art acquired in the 1970s, which it still has. One curator of the museum described this as being like our winged Victory, an object which has come through 3 different museum buildings. And it's presented not as the most advanced helicopter in the world, not as the most high technology helicopter in the world, but simply as a helicopter which is special because it was the first helicopter ever to be shown in a museum of art. If you're showing design in a museum, surely the point is to show the newest, the most technology significant, the critical pieces of design, not to show design as if it were sculpture. I always look at the example of how you understand art and how you understand design in the museum context. And they are different. Design needs understanding, it needs explanation, it needs a sense of context. You need to know why something was made, how it was made, who used it, what it did. Art speaks for itself. If you think about, if you're a museum and you're fortunate enough to have in your collection Picasso's Guernica, which is an image which shows Picasso's horror, the futility and the violence of war, it would be interesting to show the German bombers which attacked Guernica and destroyed it. It would be interesting and fascinating to show the newspapers that covered this event and made the rest of the world know about it. But to show them in the same space as Picasso's painting would be annoying. It's actually getting in the way of what the art is speaking to us directly about. But if you actually have if you have an air and space museum and you have one of the aircraft which bombed Guernica, of course it's vital to know what it did, how it did it, and what it meant. So if you have that aircraft, it would be really important perhaps to show a reproduction of Picasso's painting, because you're showing a context. And for me, design has to have that multiple levels of meaning and that way of understanding it on those levels, which is why I show this image. It's of Jasper Morrison's air chair, and it's showing how it's being made. The chair actually depends on blow molding, which is a technique developed by the car industry, which injects a form of plastic into a mold. And here is the mold at the one end of the picture, and the chair is coming out of it. And I think, for me, the object, the chair, the finished chair, is great, but much more interesting is this moment, which shows you how industrialization works. The tool which makes this object is as beautiful as the finished thing. And for me, this is the direction which the design museum which I run in London needs to take. We need to show not just what a piece of design looks like as a piece of sculpture, an object, but we need to demonstrate what it means, how it's been made, how it's used, and we also need to remind ourselves that design cannot only be understood as a history of chairs, which often is presented as being. Of course, chairs are fascinating. They tell us a lot about particular moments. They have technology in them. They have aesthetics. But what makes design so continuously interesting is that design is not a fixed area of understanding. If design stayed only as being a history of chairs, it will become very quickly irrelevant. But design is about understanding how we've moved into a non-material world. Understanding the iPhone, for example, is not simply about how Ives makes the object look. It's understanding that it transforms our consumption of music completely. Recorded music began as something that was done on metal and wax discs, and the whole form of popular music was based on the recording time that you could fit onto a disc. And the album of the rock moment was based on having 8 tracks aside. The Beatles and the Stones made music around this formula of a particular recording time, of a particular means of mechanical reproduction. And that form has now vanished. People consume music digitally, and they can choose how they download single tracks and how they listen to them, whether it's at random or not. So this whole cultural form, the album, is now of the past. You could say that the iPhone and digitalization will very quickly transform also the way we read. The idea of books with 100,000 words in them is perhaps a moment of the past also. Not sure yet, but it could be. And again, this is what technology is doing to us. Design and understanding design is a way in which we can get to grips with that. I used to worry hugely about the way that design is making us consume more quickly, more rapidly. This idea that the telephone, which once lasted 20 years, is now a mobile phone, which lasts on average 7 or 8 months, is on one hand enormously wasteful resources. In particular, it's leading to strip mining of lithium, an element which won't last for more than 25, 30 years at present rates of extraction. The mines are in the high deserts of Chile and other places where terrible environmental damage is being done, and there are literally millions and millions of mobile phones that we throw away. On the other hand, if one is a designer asking questions, it's important to think about the other things that a mobile phone does. It means that we no longer have cameras, music players. It means we no longer have camera shops or music shops or the systems that distribute that or the wax that makes records. Maybe we could understand, maybe if we did the sums and the research carefully enough, we might begin to understand what the real ecological balance is, what the audit really means. Is the mobile phone, which you dispose of every 7 months, because it does away with so much other kind of consumption, really something that does allow us to have guilt-free consumption or not? Design for me is a way in which we can ask questions about the world. And I think I've been probably talking for almost an hour, so I think I might stop now and ask the audience if there are any questions about any of these issues I've raised, or not. And I hope the translation worked. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure if you raised this question in the presentation, but I would like to know your opinion about design in the architecture and whether is it possible to make ugly things beautiful. Because if you've seen the Moscow suburbs, for example, we've got so many like ugly buildings, these blocks of ordinary buildings which look like the area in London called the Elephant and Castle. So what's your opinion? How to make these buildings beautiful? How to transform them? Is it possible to do it with the help of design?
I think you might say that Moscow has too many interesting buildings and too many buildings being camouflaged behind advertising. To me, Moscow is full of wonderful things, which will be made even more wonderful if they were cared for carefully. I think one of the things that if I could wave a wand and magically transform the situation here, it would be to give people an understanding of the importance of material qualities, of looking after things in a way which respects where they come from and not imposing a reconstruction in plastic and unsympathetic new materials. And a sense of understanding that age and wear can be beautiful. And replicas very rarely are. The other part of the question, I guess, is about the relationship between design and architecture. And in a way, because architecture has been around so much longer than design, it's like the elder brother, and architects, of course, believe they can do everything. Write, become intellectuals, take the photographs, make the magazine, write the book, design the furniture, do the building, design the clothes. And designers sort of have come more recently, and there is less design theory, and much of design theory is borrowed from architecture. So architecture had a postmodern moment, and so did design. And I think design is only now becoming mature enough to develop its own set of thinking and theories. But they are close but different. There is this scale issue. It's amazing how Italy is a country which produced so many people who were trained as architects, who became really good designers, really interesting designers, and then somehow want to migrate back to architecture. And the scale jump is so difficult. A building is not a very large chair, but so many of these buildings are built as if they were. Architecture is should not be about objects to me. They're different scales. And they have different material qualities too. And too often one can say that contemporary architecture is designed as if it was a refrigerator. It looks great on the day it comes out of the shop, but pretty quickly, if you leave a refrigerator in the rain, it looks horrible. But the first person to really talk about this relationship that I found was fascinating was Ernesto Nathan Rogers, who was one of the editors of Domus. And in 1946 he wrote this very famous text, of course exaggerating for effect, in which he suggested that if you analyze a spoon carefully enough, you could understand the kind of city that the culture that made that spoon would build. Which, of course, could give you some pretty misleading ideas about London. If you flew there, British Airways, and looked at your plastic spoon that you were using to eat your all-day breakfast with.
Silly with Russia.
Nowadays.
Explain the obsession with
white color.
White color?
Yeah. Why there are so many things nowadays made of white color? I don't understand this. And what's the logic behind making these things of white color? What is so beautiful in this color? Because I personally don't see it as a beautiful color, for example. It's also, I understand that it all started with iPhone, iBooks, and whatever. But nowadays, I see that more and more things are being done with white color.
There is, I think a fundamental human characteristic is that we are interested in change and fluctuation. You can speculate. There are all kinds of physiological reasons. Night and dark, winter and summer, and there is deep down this idea of change, which is sometimes exploited by the idea that we are persuaded to buy something new, which is different, and the difference might simply be color, and that's an idea which comes from people like Raymond Loewy and the 1930s, and the idea that we can get our way out of a recession or a slump or a crash by persuading people to buy things, and that depends on us being made to see something as looking great and cool, and at the same time being persuaded that what we used to have is terrible and old-fashioned and must go. And you can see color in this sense. if you look back at what London interiors, and I guess Moscow ones too, in the 1970s were like, it's unbelievable that we actually saw orange as being a colour as desirable for the interior. Something chemical seems to have happened to our brains. We see these colours entirely differently. And certain colours express certain moments very powerfully. And then, of course, suddenly we go through a switch and we see everything that we thought was great looks terrible. And you could say that white was a response to a particular moment. And in the history of Apple, white was what replaced all those citrus colours that the initial iBooks were. So it was raspberry, strawberry, lime. And then suddenly, no, let's have white. It's pure, it's clean, it's special. And once you have a successful company like Apple doing it, of course, Samsung does it, and LG does it. And white suddenly for a minute becomes the colour of modernity and freshness and purity. And then very quickly it becomes the colour of 1997. And you have black instead, which jumps again. Is that an answer?
Can you tell the solution of contradiction between authorship and a new open source world where the files are copied to torrent sites and objects product design are copied by the Chinese mining companies? What would be the possible solution to that?
I had a delegation come to the Design Museum from Beijing, which was talking about Beijing wants to become world design capital next year. No, the year after. It's Helsinki next year. And of course, I said, thank you for asking, it's very flattering, and of course there's many things about China which is really exciting, and it's becoming very interested in design, but there is this issue about intellectual property, and how can one become a design capital if there is no protection of what the designer's work is? And there is, of course, this big fight between the idea of open source and intellectual copyright and protection. And design becomes really difficult to do if there is no financial reward or respect for the people that do it. Another question in the back. Yeah.
A lot about colors, about black, white, orange, red, mixtures of these colors. So I'd like to ask you a question. Why your presentation is black and white?
Because these images all come from the book that I wrote, which was deliberately designed to look like a prayer book. Small, square, and inside there was no colour at all. All the images were black and white, so they weren't seductive, except for three. And there were three pictures in which I compared a Walter PPK automatic pistol, which was designed for use by the German police in 1929, which was black, except for the red dot, which is where the safety catch was. And it was very important that you knew when the safety catch was on and off, because otherwise you put it in your pocket and shoot your foot off. The other image in black and in colour was of the Volkswagen Golf, which was a car which was designed by Giudietto Giorgiario, and the most cool model was also all black, except for a little red line around the radiator grille. And the last one was the Tizio Light by Richard Sapper, which is also matte black, except for a little red dot where the switch is. So I was trying to make the point that this is the designer, Richard Sapper, using images from other machines to communicate a sense of what colour can do and cannot do. So that's not answering your question, but the first part of my answer was trying to de-seductivize these images, trying to put some distance between what the object is in the image and ourselves, and black and white does that. It sort of distances us from them.
destructive, the distance.
We are all victims of our own contradictions, and as I did say, in many ways, the book I wrote was an exorcism. I knew, I wrote the book because of that episode with the MacBook in Heathrow Airport, and I was trying to explore and understand the processes at work, but I also want to sell books.
I got a question. Hello, here. When you hear the phrase Russian design, what do you first think about?
The Kalashnikov.
Okay, that's
Which actually is not a facetious answer, because you would say that the Kalashnikov, despite its appalling results, is a response to difficult conditions, making something that's easy to maintain and works in a simple way and communicates its purpose to its users. So if you could take some of those skills and apply them to something less destructive, that would be the most positive kind of Russian design for me. Another question at the back.
Examples of a physical design making its way to digital world, and I phone calculator. And the benefits is great. You get say a few words on what you call design and the digital when you move away from the physical industrial.
It's interesting how the digital world has not replaced the physical one. You could see our digital world as producing a hunger for more physical experiences. I went from being a magazine editor and a journalist and a newspaper writer to making exhibitions and then a museum director. And I began to realize that these are very different processes, and they produce very different results. You very rarely, in the days of paper journalism, had much feedback. It's different now with blogs and sites where there is an instant response. But even so, the feedback that one had as a print journalist was pretty rare. Sometimes someone would try and sue you for libel. Every so often, someone would want to know where did the carpet in Zaha Hadid's Opera House come from? Really useful question. But usually it was like putting a message into a bottle. But sitting in a museum, you see an audience and you see people's responses, and you realize that museum going will survive as an activity because it is a shared experience. People can go and see an exhibition together. It's not like, you don't look at a screen together. Well, you did in the old days of cathode ray TV sets, but now the digital experience is a very solitary one. So the kind of music that goes on making money for performers is live performance and the merchandise that goes with that. And the digital information is downloaded free. And I think you can see the same for books, that people one day are going to buy books copyright free, but there will be literary festivals where you actually go and see the author. And with design and museums, the museum going experience is the one that will survive, and design magazines, I think, are going to be in trouble. Already, for us, a successful architecture exhibition, we will sell 70,000 tickets to a show, which in 3 months. Now, I don't think any magazine on architecture and design in the world will sell 70,000 copies. So already, we see that there's a hunger for primary experiences. So that's a kind of wider observation about digital and physical world design. But in terms of how design is treated by designers, it's not new that the designer of the physical object has been removed from the content. I mean, Raymond Loewy did not know how to make a railway engine work, but he could make the engine look pretty sexy. Jonathan Ives does know what the inside of an iPhone looks like. He once showed me an amazing fly-through of the inside of an iPhone, which was like navigating a city in a moving aircraft. But it's not, he doesn't write the software. these things are all made by groups of people, and understanding the connection between the physical and the digital is really interesting. Understanding ways in which digital can give us memories of the things that we need from the physical world is important. And understanding what the digital world does to the way that we see the world is fascinating. Of course, digitalization has abolished privacy. You know, you never actually meet someone who's a complete stranger ever again, because even while you're eating in the restaurant or the bar with them, you can Google to see who they are, where they've been. There is no privacy anymore. These are all big changes, and the kind of ways in which design analyzes behavior has got to catch up with this kind of stuff. Anyone else? Thank you.